The cold that night was unforgiving. Wind howled through the streets like a chorus of ghosts, slipping beneath scarves and coats and numbing even the warmest layers. Jonathan Reeves, CEO of one of the largest tech conglomerates on the East Coast, stepped out of his black car, irritation creasing his brows. He hated delays, and the client dinner was already running 10 minutes behind. His assistant was still on the phone confirming the reservation, murmuring apologies he no longer cared to listen to. But just as Jonathan turned toward the glowing entrance of the restaurant, he stopped. At first, he thought it was a pile of old blankets or discarded trash beside the alley, but then it moved. A child. She was no older than 7, thin, too thin. Her coat was barely a coat at all, ripped at the sleeves, stained and worn, as though it had braved more winters than any child should have to. She sat huddled next to a garbage bin, arms locked around her knees, her breath barely visible against the bitter air. Her skin was pale from cold, but her eyes, when they met his, held something ancient. Not fear, not even desperation, just quiet acceptance. Jonathan didn't move for a moment. He couldn't. Something about her presence struck at the very center of him. Something buried deep beneath layers of strategy meetings, stock evaluations, and press interviews. She looked at him like she expected nothing. Not kindness, not cruelty, just nothing at all. He glanced back at the restaurant, where warm light and polished glass promised safety and distance from this world outside. But he didn't turn away. Slowly, almost against his own will, Jonathan stepped forward. The girl's body tensed. She didn't speak. Kneeling beside her, he took off his gloves. He didn't touch her, just met her eyes again, softer this time. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual, almost a whisper. "Want to have dinner with us?" She blinked, uncertain. Her lips parted slightly but said nothing. Jonathan stood up and extended his hand. For a long moment, she didn't move. But then, as if some invisible string gently tugged her forward, she reached out. Her fingers were ice. He led her across the sidewalk, his assistant staring in disbelief. People turned to look as they entered the restaurant together, their silhouettes cutting across the glow of candlelit tables and crystal glasses. The girl's feet dragged on the polished tile, her eyes wide not with wonder, but with fear. Jonathan didn't look at anyone else. He simply pulled out a chair for her, sat across from her, and for the first time in years, he forgot everything waiting for him on the other side of the door. The waiter approached, cautious. Jonathan ordered quietly, without explanation. The girl sat in silence, staring at the untouched bread basket in front of her. After a long moment, she reached for a roll slowly, like she was afraid it might vanish if she moved too fast. She took a bite, then another. Her shoulders relaxed, just barely. Jonathan watched her, something heavy swelling in his chest. She still hadn't said a word, but she didn't need to, because in the silence between them, something had already begun to change. The room was too elegant for someone like her. That's what the eyes around them seemed to say. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light on fine linen and imported silverware. But all Lila saw were the hands holding menus, the mouths whispering behind napkins, and the stares that lingered too long. Jonathan noticed them too, the stares, the unspoken judgment. A few familiar faces from the business world sat only a table or two away, their curiosity thinly veiled behind forced smiles. But he didn't care. For once, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and spoke with a calm edge. Making sure the waitstaff understood, he expected silence, not questions. Lila sat still, her small hands resting on the table's edge like she wasn't sure she belonged there. She watched the glass of water in front of her as though it might tip over on its own. Her coat, still damp with melting snow, clung to her arms. When the food arrived, her body tensed again. Jonathan had ordered grilled chicken and mashed potatoes for her. Simple, gentle, something warm. She waited until the waiter walked away before glancing at Jonathan. Still, no words came from her lips. He nodded slightly, giving her unspoken permission. She reached out, picked up a fork, and began to eat slowly at first, then faster. Not greedy, not messy, just careful, like someone used to going without. She didn't chew too long, didn't pause to savor, just made sure each bite counted. "You have a name?" Jonathan asked quietly. She didn't look up, just nodded. "Can I know it?" A pause, then, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "Lila." He repeated it in his mind. Lila, like something fragile that might disappear if said too loudly. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Lila. She shook her head once. Her voice didn't come back. Jonathan sat back, taking in the girl sitting across from him, 7, maybe 8. Bones too visible beneath her skin, a bruise just beneath her jaw. Her shoes were mismatched. Her socks were gone. She didn't ask him for anything, not even when she was clearly starving. That silence spoke volumes, and it did something to him, something he hadn't expected. The conversation at the next table grew louder, something about stock prices and IPOs. Jonathan glanced at them, then turned back to Lila. The contrast between her fragile presence and their loud privilege made his throat tighten. "I'll get you a warm bed tonight," he said. "Just for tonight." Okay, Lila looked up. For the first time, her eyes held something close to fear, not of him, but of promises. Promises that might not last. She didn't answer, but she didn't refuse. After dinner, he walked her out. She shivered beneath the city lights. He gave her his coat, wrapping it around her small shoulders, and opened the car door. The driver hesitated. Jonathan simply nodded. Back at the hotel, he requested the penthouse suite not for himself, but because he didn't know where else to take her that didn't feel like another shelter or holding cell. He told the staff nothing. They understood not to ask. Lila walked inside slowly, eyes darting from one lamp to the next, one rug to the next, as though trying to memorize everything before it vanished. She didn't speak. She didn't complain. As Jonathan prepared the pull-out bed in the guest room, she lay down on the carpet instead, curling into a ball like it was the safest place in the world. He tried to convince her otherwise, but she only shook her head, whispering something too soft to catch. Jonathan didn't press. He just stood in the doorway and watched her fall asleep. And for the first time in a very long while, he didn't think about quarterly losses or morning meetings. He just stood there, wondering how long she'd been surviving this way, and why no one had noticed until now. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the hotel suite, casting a soft glow across the carpet. Jonathan stirred in the armchair where he dozed off, still wearing yesterday's clothes. His neck ached, and the room smelled faintly of linen spray and silence. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he turned his head and remembered. Lila was still curled up on the carpet near the couch, arms folded tightly against her chest, face pressed into the floor like she was bracing for something. She hadn't moved at all. He stood slowly, careful not to startle her. His first instinct was to check his phone. Dozens of missed calls, emails, reminders. His calendar was packed from 7 a.m. to midnight, but none of it felt urgent anymore. Instead, he knelt beside Lila and softly said her name. She opened her eyes, blinking as if pulled out of a different world. Then she sat up, brushing her sleeves like she was apologizing for taking up space. "Hey," Jonathan said gently. There's a bed right over there. You know, with blankets, a mattress, pillows. She looked at him, uncertain, then looked away. He didn't push. Are you hungry? A faint nod. Downstairs. He brought her to the quiet corner of the hotel cafe. She ordered nothing but toast, and even then, she left the crust. Jonathan watched her in silence, trying to imagine how many mornings she'd spent with nothing at all. After breakfast, he made a decision. He canceled his meetings, sent a message to his assistant with 2 words, reschedule everything. Lila clutched his coat as they stepped back into the cold. Jonathan walked slowly, unsure of what he was doing but knowing he couldn't send her back into the streets. Not now, not after seeing her asleep on the carpet, not after hearing nothing but silence in her sleep. They stopped in front of a public elementary school a few blocks from the hotel. He crouched beside her. Is this your school? She didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, It used to be. They walked through the front doors. A security guard looked at them suspiciously, but Jonathan's tone, measured and professional, opened the way. Soon, they were in the office, facing the school's vice principal, a kind-eyed woman named Miss Temple. Jonathan explained that Lila had no place to stay and might have been a student here. Ms. Temple searched through the files, frowning slightly. Yes, Lila Brunner. She was enrolled last year, but she stopped coming a few months ago. We tried contacting her mother. No response. Jonathan leaned forward. Do you have any emergency contacts? She shook her head. No, just her mother's name. Maya Brunner. He glanced at Lila. Her face had gone blank, as if she'd shut herself off the moment her mother's name was spoken. Ms. Temple continued, lowering her voice. We suspected something. Teachers noticed she was coming in without lunch, falling asleep in class. We filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. We didn't know where she went. Jonathan felt anger rise not at Mrs. Temple, but at the system, at the fact that a child could simply vanish and no one had followed through. He thanked her, gently took Lila's hand, and left. Outside, she looked up at him and finally asked, Am I in trouble? The question broke something in him. No, Lila, he said, you're not in trouble, not even a little. She looked away again, but this time he noticed her eyes glistened. They walked the rest of the way in silence, her fingers gripping his coat tighter. And though she said nothing, a quiet shift had begun. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the walls she had built around herself. And for the first time since he had taken her hand, Jonathan knew this wouldn't be just for one night. Back in the suite, the mood had shifted. Lila no longer hovered near the corners of the room like a shadow. She sat on the couch now, feet tucked under her, watching the muted television without really watching. Jonathan observed her from the dining table, phone pressed to his ear. I need everything you can find on Maya Brunner, he said quietly. Medical history, address, employment records, whatever's available, discreetly. His longtime investigator on the other end hesitated before replying. Jonathan, this isn't the usual kind of request. I know. Just do it. He hung up, unsure if he was crossing lines or simply doing what someone else should have done long ago. As the hours passed, Lila became more present, in her own way. She began asking soft questions, almost afraid to speak them aloud. Is this a hotel? Yes, Jonathan replied. Do they let kids stay here? They do now. She nodded like that made perfect sense, then returned her attention to the TV. A cartoon played, full of color and noise, but her face remained still, unmoved. That evening, Jonathan brought her a tray of food macaroni, sliced apples, and hot chocolate. She thanked him with her eyes more than her voice. When she finished, she handed the empty mug back to him like a secret. He sat across from her again, unsure where to start. She was still a child, and yet there was nothing childish in the way she carried herself. "Lila," he said carefully, "do you remember where your mom is?" She didn't look at him. Her hands twisted in her lap. "She got sick," she whispered. "I waited at the hospital, but they told me she had to go away." Jonathan's heart tightened. "Did they say where?" They said she had to sleep for a while. "And then someone came to take me. I didn't know them, so I left." Her voice broke at the edges, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried once since he met her. It was somehow worse than tears. "Do you remember her name?" "Your mom's full name, Maya Brunner." He nodded slowly, confirming the spelling he'd already given the investigator. "And your dad?" She shrugged. "Never had one." That night, after she fell asleep, this time on the couch, wrapped in one of the hotel's oversized blankets, Jonathan stood by the window, phone in hand, waiting for a response. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting the city in silence. A message lit up the screen. "Found something. Maya Brunner, 32. Admitted to County General 2 months ago. Critical condition. No listed next of kin." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He called immediately. "She's in a coma," the investigator said on the other end. "No visitors. No identification until 2 days ago when the hospital logged her as Jane Doe. They messed up the paperwork." Jonathan turned toward the sleeping girl, heart sinking. "She's alive for now." He hung up. The quiet of the room pressed in, heavy with truth. He sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at Lila's sleeping form. So small, so alone, and yet somehow so strong. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't even expected it. But now she would get it, whether she trusted him or not. He pulled the blanket gently around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, Jonathan whispered something he never thought he'd say again. "I promise, I won't leave you." The next morning, Lila awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows and the smell of something unfamiliar: toast, eggs, coffee. She sat up slowly, blinking, unsure for a moment where she was. Then she saw Jonathan standing at the counter, stirring sugar into a cup. He turned toward her and gave a small smile. "You slept through breakfast, but I saved you a plate." She didn't smile back, but she nodded. Polite. Always polite. Like someone taught long ago that being polite might keep her safe. After she finished eating, Jonathan helped her into a fresh set of clothes he had quietly purchased the night before: socks, a sweater, shoes that actually fit. She touched the soles like they might melt away. "We're going somewhere today," he said gently. "I want to show you something." Lila didn't ask questions. She just followed. The shelter sat on the edge of the city gray brick, cracked pavement, its front steps lined with cigarette butts and forgotten wrappers. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air smelled of bleach and old beds. As they entered, Lila's body shifted, her shoulders locked, her hands fisted inside the sleeves of her sweater. She stopped walking. Her eyes flicked toward the rows of cots, the bulletin boards with missing person flyers, the plastic chairs filled with women and children who looked a lot like her. "I don't want to stay here," she said, her voice small and certain. Jonathan knelt beside her. "You're not. I just wanted to see where you've been, to understand." She stared at him like she didn't believe him, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because she'd probably been promised too many things before that never came true. One of the shelter volunteers, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached them. She's been here before, the woman said. Quiet girl. Came in once with a social worker. Wasn't here long. Lila's fingers gripped Jonathan's sleeve now. Tight. We tried placing her. The woman continued. But she kept running. We called CPS. But, well, you know how it is. Not enough staff. Not enough funding. She slipped through the cracks. Jonathan said nothing. His jaw clenched. He didn't want to hear excuses. He wanted to know how a child like Lila could go missing, and no one, not a single person, had come looking. When they walked out, Lila didn't let go of his hand. Not even once. Back at the hotel, she finally asked, "Do I have to go back there?" "No," Jonathan said quietly. "Not ever. But I'm not yours." He paused. The sentence hit him like a quiet blow to the chest. "No," he said, "but that doesn't mean I'll leave you." She looked away. That night, as she lay curled on the couch again, Jonathan sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through legal documents on his laptop. He had already contacted a lawyer, one he trusted with personal matters. Temporary guardianship was complicated, especially when there was no blood relation, no prior connection, but not impossible. The next step was custody, and he didn't care how long it took. He glanced at Lila one more time. Her eyes were closed, but her hand rested near the edge of the couch, facing outward, open, as if waiting for something. Without thinking, he reached out and gently placed his palm over hers. Her fingers twitched. Then softly, they curled into his. Still no words. Just quiet trust. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And in Jonathan's world, where everything had once been measured in profits and percentages this small, silent moment felt like the most important thing he'd ever held. The next morning, Jonathan stood at the hotel window long after the sun had risen, his coffee cold in his hand. He had been silent for most of the morning, staring out at the city's skyline like it had asked him a question he didn't know how to answer. Behind him, Layla sat cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book he had picked up from the hotel gift shop. Her focus was steady, her brow furrowed as if she were solving something more serious than a page of flowers. He turned to her quietly. "We're taking a drive today." She didn't ask where, just nodded and began packing up her crayons. They drove out of the city, the car growing quieter the farther they went. Skyscrapers faded into rows of brick buildings, then to quiet neighborhoods, and finally into narrow roads lined with tired houses and leaning trees. Jonathan hadn't been here in decades. The deeper they went, the more his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Lila looked out the window, sensing something unspoken, the kind of silence that carried history. They stopped in front of a house that sagged slightly on one side, its wooden porch chipped, the steps uneven. Jonathan stepped out and stood there for a long time before saying anything. "I used to live here," he said, almost to himself. Lila blinked, then looked up at the house again. "My grandmother raised me after my parents left," he continued. "She worked nights, slept maybe 3 hours a day. We barely had enough, but she never let me feel it. I remember. One winter, we ran out of heating oil. I slept in my coat for 2 weeks." He didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe because she never asked questions. Maybe because her silence made room for truths he had kept buried. "She died while I was in college," he added. "I didn't make it home in time. I told myself I was too busy with finals, that I had no way to leave. But the truth is, I didn't want to come back here." They stood there together, just looking. The wind rustled dead leaves across the porch, inside the car again. Lila finally spoke. "Did you run away too?" Jonathan looked at her. She wasn't accusing him. She was asking because she understood. "I think I did," he said, "just not with my feet." I ran away by forgetting. She nodded once, like that made perfect sense. Back in the city, the sky began to turn gray again. Snow in the forecast. That evening, after they returned to the hotel, Jonathan pulled out an old storybook he had found in the building's tiny library. He sat on the edge of the bed and read aloud while Lila sat beside him, arms wrapped around her knees. Halfway through the story, she leaned her head lightly against his arm. He kept reading, voice steady, never looking down. But something inside him tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of hope he hadn't felt in years. By the time he closed the book, she was asleep again, curled against him like she had belonged there all along. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Reeves, billionaire, boardroom tactician, maker of men and markets, realized that the one thing he had never managed to build was a home. But maybe, just maybe, that was starting to change. The next day, the winter sun fought to break through gray clouds, casting a weak, watery light over the city. Jonathan didn't go into the office. Instead, he made one phone call to the hospital where the investigator had said Maya Brunner was staying. Yes, the nurse confirmed cautiously. She was admitted under Jane Doe. We just updated the file 2 days ago. Maya Brunner in a coma, severe hypothermia, signs of malnourishment, and untreated pneumonia. She's stable, but still unconscious. Jonathan listened in silence, eyes on Lila, who sat at the hotel desk sketching in silence. "Can I bring someone to see her?" he asked. A pause. "You're not family. I'm the only one this little girl has right now." After a long hesitation, the nurse finally gave him a time slot, brief, unofficial, but better than nothing. Later that morning, they arrived at the county hospital. The building was old, the paint peeling, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. Lila held Jonathan's hand tightly as they walked past wheelchairs and exhausted nurses, patients waiting on benches, silence hanging heavy. When they reached the ICU, the nurse led them quietly to a small, dim room. Machines beeped steadily. Tubes ran from the thin body in the bed to hanging bags and monitors. The woman was barely recognizable, sunken cheeks, chapped lips, dark hair matted to her scalp. But the moment Lila stepped inside, her body stilled. She stared for a long time. Then, without prompting, she let go of Jonathan's hand and walked slowly to the side of the bed. "Mama," her voice cracked. There was no reply, only the beep of the heart monitor and the quiet rhythm of the ventilator. Lila reached out and gently touched her mother's fingers. "I waited," she whispered. "You said to wait." "I did." Her eyes were dry, but her small hand trembled against Maya's. Jonathan stayed near the door, not wanting to interrupt. Something ancient passed between them, words unspoken, emotions too big for language. She began to hum softly, a melody she had carried with her, the same one her mother used to sing at night, before everything changed. Jonathan looked away, jaw clenched against the weight of what he was witnessing. After a few minutes, the nurse stepped in gently and said their time was up. Lila leaned down and kissed her mother's forehead. "I'll come again," she said, like it was a promise sealed in truth. They rode back in silence. That night, Lila didn't sleep on the couch. She climbed into the guest bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. Jonathan stood in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. But then she said softly, "She's not gone. I can feel it." He nodded. "She's still fighting." Lila closed her eyes. Jonathan stood there a moment longer, then turned off the light. And in the dark, he realized that this quiet war they were both now part of was no longer temporary. He wasn't just helping. he was choosing. The next morning, the headlines hit like a thunderclap. Cold-hearted CEO takes in homeless girl PR move or midlife crisis. Jonathan Reeves seen leaving county hospital with child. What is he hiding? Photographs of Jonathan and Lila entering the hospital were splashed across tabloid websites. One image caught Lila mid-step, clutching his coat sleeve. Another showed him placing a gentle hand on her back. The captions, however, were anything but gentle. Jonathan stared at the screen, jaw tight, then closed the laptop. His company's board had called an emergency meeting. His assistant left a dozen voicemails. Investors were demanding explanations. But he didn't pick up. Not yet. Instead, he sat across from Lila at the hotel's breakfast table. She was quiet, as always, spreading jelly over toast with deep focus. When she noticed his silence, she looked up. "Are you mad at me?" she asked. Jonathan's chest ached at the question. "No, sweetheart. Never." He met with his lawyer that afternoon, a sharp but measured woman named Andrea Holt, who had handled his estate work for years. This was the first time he came to her, not about assets, but about a child. "Temporary guardianship is possible," Andrea said, flipping through documents. "But it won't be easy. You're not a relative. There's no existing relationship prior to last week. The state could challenge your right to keep her, especially once they find out her mother is still alive." "What if I fund her mother's care, cover all medical bills, rehab, keep them both safe?" Andrea looked up. "You'd still need court approval, and Child Protective Services might argue you're interfering with due process." Jonathan didn't flinch. "I'm not giving her up." Andrea leaned back, studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we fight." But the blowback came faster than expected. That night, the board held a video meeting. Half the faces were concerned. The other half furious. "You're jeopardizing the company's image." One executive barked, "You vanished from the office, dodged calls, and now the media is painting you as unstable." Jonathan stayed calm. "I took in a child who was freezing alone in the street. That's not instability. That's decency. This isn't about charity. It's about shareholders, reputation." "I'm not asking for permission," he said flatly. A few stunned seconds of silence followed. Then a quiet voice, an older board member, spoke with surprising clarity. "Sometimes the story people tell about you is more powerful than the ones you try to control. And this story might save us all from becoming what we fear most." The meeting ended without a vote, but the tension remained. Later, back in the suite, Jonathan found Lila sitting on the window ledge wrapped in a blanket, watching the snowfall. Her reflection shimmered against the glass, small, thoughtful, still. He sat beside her. "Do you want to go back to your mother when she wakes up?" he asked gently. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I want her to wake up. I want her to be okay. But I'm scared to leave you." His throat tightened. "You won't have to choose. Not if I can help it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. That night, as the city froze beneath another blanket of snow, Jonathan Reeves, once untouchable, once untethered, realized he was no longer trying to protect a company, or a name, or even himself. He was protecting a child, and no headline in the world could change that. The suite slowly began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like something resembling home. There were still reminders of luxury marble counters, velvet drapes, a fireplace that came on with a switch, but now the space carried new signs of life: a half-finished drawing on the coffee table, a toothbrush beside the sink, a pair of small shoes kicked off by the door. Lila's laughter, once so rare, began to appear in gentle, surprising bursts soft giggles when Jonathan failed to flip a pancake properly, or when he let her style his hair with a ridiculous amount of gel. She never asked for toys, only paper and crayons. He gave her stacks. She filled each page quietly, drawing images of houses, warm kitchens, a woman with long hair, and a tall man beside her. One evening, Jonathan found a drawing folded on his pillow. It was a house, drawn in careful detail. In front of it stood three figures: a little girl in a purple dress, a woman with a blanket over her shoulders, and a man in a dark suit with kind eyes. Over them, in bold, shaky letters, Lila had written, "My New Family." He stared at the page for a long time. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, head bowed, overwhelmed in a way no boardroom ever prepared him for. The next day, he took her shopping not to impress her, but to give her a choice. They walked into a department store and wandered past racks of clothes and shelves of books. When they passed the children's section, Lila paused in front of a soft, pastel quilt. "You like it?" he asked. She didn't answer. But when he offered to carry it, she smiled and said, "For my bed," he nodded. "For your room." She blinked. "I have a room you will." That afternoon, Jonathan met with a real estate agent and put in an offer on a brownstone with wide windows and a quiet garden. He didn't ask about resale value or market forecast. He only asked if there was space enough for Lila to grow. Back at the hotel, they cooked dinner together, mac and cheese. Her choice. She stirred the pot while he read from a book she picked from the gift shop. She looked up once and asked, "Is it okay if I call you something?" He paused. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" Her voice was barely audible. "Not Daddy, just my Jonathan." His heart clenched. He smiled softly. "That's perfect." Later that night, while Lila slept peacefully beneath her new quilt, Jonathan stood in the living room, lights low, fireplace humming behind him. He looked around at the small signs of life, of love, none of it planned, all of it real. He thought back to who he was just a few weeks ago: powerful, respected, alone. A man surrounded by everything except purpose. And now he was learning how to love someone who needed him not for what he had, but for who he was willing to become. And in that quiet, flickering light, he realized this was what love looked like. Not polished, not perfect, just real, just enough. The days passed gently, each one more tender than the last. Lila had begun sleeping through the night, her breathing steady, no longer curled up in a protective ball but stretched out beneath the quilt she had chosen herself. Mornings were filled with simple rituals: breakfast at the small table, brushing her hair while she made faces in the mirror, picking out which book to read before bed. But every afternoon, without fail, they returned to the hospital. Lila sat beside her mother, whispering stories, singing songs in a voice only Maya might hear. She brought drawings each day, a picture of the new brownstone Jonathan had bought, one of her eating pancakes, one with all three of them in the garden. The nurses began to recognize her routine. They never stopped her. Some even smiled when they saw her arrive. Jonathan watched from the hallway most days, letting Lila have those quiet moments alone. Maya remained unchanged, still, pale, silent. But something about the room felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Then one morning, it happened. Lila sat beside her mother, with her fingers wrapped gently around Maya's limp hand. She had just finished humming the melody they both knew, the one she always sang when saying goodbye. "Mama," she whispered, "you can wake up now." Her eyes dropped to the sketch in her lap, a new one, a drawing of Maya in bed. smiling, with Lila beside her. That's when it happened. A twitch. Lila gasped and leaned forward. Mama. The hand in hers shifted, barely but clearly. She bolted upright and ran into the hall, shouting Jonathan's name, her voice trembling with something that was neither fear nor joy, but both at once. Doctors and nurses rushed in. Jonathan scooped her into his arms, heart thundering as they followed. Monitors beeped more quickly now. The once still woman in the bed blinked once, then twice. Her lips moved. One word. Lila. The room fell silent. No one dared breathe. Lila stood at the edge of the bed, too stunned to speak. Then her eyes filled, and she smiled a full, unguarded, trembling smile. I knew you were still here, she whispered. Jonathan turned away, wiping his face before anyone could see. The tears came before he could stop them, not from sorrow, but from something deeper. Relief, hope, redemption. Later, after the medical team had finished their assessments and Maya had drifted back into a light, recovering sleep, Jonathan sat quietly with Lila in the hospital cafeteria. She swung her legs beneath the chair, sipping apple juice with both hands. She remembered me, she said softly. He nodded. She never forgot. She said my name. I heard. Layla looked up at him then. Do you think she'll be okay? Jonathan answered honestly. It'll take time, but she's alive. That's a start. She leaned her head against his arm and sighed. Can we still stay with you? Until she's strong. He hesitated only for a second. You're not going anywhere, I'm not. Outside. The first real sunlight in days broke through the clouds. Inside, something long frozen had finally begun to thaw. A mother had come back, a daughter had held on, and a man who once thought himself incapable of family had been given the gift of one, whether he was ready for it or not. Maya's recovery was slow, but steady. She remained in the hospital for 2 more weeks. Her body weakened, but her memory intact. Her voice was hoarse at first, her hands trembling as she reached for the little cup of water each morning. But her eyes, those eyes, never lost their light. Each day, Lila returned to her mother's side, always with a new story to tell about the brownstone with the crooked staircase, the time Jonathan tried to bake cookies and set off the fire alarm, or the way the hotel chef had let her help decorate a cake with far too much icing. Maya listened to everything, smiling more with each visit, her strength coming back not just through medicine, but through the sound of her daughter's laughter. Jonathan, for his part, stayed in the background at first. He signed medical forms, made calls, arranged a private nurse for Maya when she was discharged, but he kept his distance, emotionally unsure of where he now stood. He had stepped in when there was no one else, but Maya was awake now. A mother had returned. Would Lila still need him one afternoon? Maya asked to see him alone. He entered the hospital room, unsure of what she'd say. She looked thinner than he remembered, but more alive than ever. Her voice was soft, but steady. You saved my daughter's life, she said, and mine too. Jonathan sat in the chair beside her. I didn't do much. She smiled faintly. Don't lie to a woman who's seen her child sleep peacefully for the first time in months. He swallowed hard. I only wanted to help, and you did. More than I ever could have imagined. But now I need to ask why he didn't answer right away. Then he said, because I saw myself in her. I saw a child no one came for, and I couldn't walk away. Maya nodded, her gaze steady. She loves you. Not because you rescued her, but because you stayed. Jonathan looked away, unsure what to do with that. Maya continued. She told me she doesn't call you Dad, Just my Jonathan. Like you belong to her in a way that doesn't need a title. He chuckled under his breath, then grew quiet again. She'll always be mine, Maya said. But if you're willing, I'd like her to always be yours too. He looked at her then, surprised. Are you sure? Maya's eyes welled up. I've never been more sure of anything. I can be her mother again. But I know now I don't have to be the only one who loves her like that. When Maya was finally discharged, it was Jonathan who brought her home to their home. The brownstone was warm and full of small touches that Lila had chosen herself, a teacup set for her mom, a welcome mat that read, "Home at last," a hand-drawn sign taped to the kitchen wall that said, "This house has 3 hearts." That first evening together, they ate dinner around the table like a family, Jonathan at the head, Maya beside him, Lila bouncing between seats as she told stories and passed the bread with great ceremony. The light above them was soft, the snow outside beginning to fall again. Later, Lila placed 3 ornaments on the small tree in the living room, one for each of them, and when she crawled into bed that night, she didn't ask who she belonged to. She already knew. This wasn't the kind of family written in legal forms or bloodlines. This was the kind made of second chances, of quiet bravery, of 3 people who had lost everything and still, somehow, found their way to each other. A new kind of family, built not on what had been, but on everything they chose to be now. Snow blanketed the city like a hush, softening the edges of rooftops, cars, and street signs. Inside the brownstone, warmth pulsed through every corner, scented candles flickered on the windowsills, and laughter floated up from the kitchen like music. It was Christmas Eve. Lila danced between rooms in a red sweater 3 sizes too big, humming to herself, her bare feet skimming over the hardwood floors. Maya sat on the living room couch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, a blanket over her lap. Her strength was returning, little by little, the color creeping back into her cheeks. And for the first time in months, her eyes were not clouded by fear. Jonathan stood at the kitchen island, wearing an apron Lila had made with marker-scrawled letters, Chef Johnny. He was stirring hot cocoa with cinnamon, careful not to burn it. Lila had become very opinionated about how it should taste. "More marshmallows," she declared, sliding onto a stool. "Again, it's Christmas." He chuckled and added a few more. The brownstone was decorated modestly, but every piece held meaning. A hand-painted ornament Lila made at school, paper snowflakes on the windows, stockings hung not with names, but with symbols. Lila had drawn a star for Maya, a tree for Jonathan, and a heart for herself. After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace. Maya read aloud from the night before Christmas, while Lila leaned against her side, eyes wide and glowing. Jonathan sat across from them, watching not the story, but the way Maya's hand brushed back Lila's curls, the way Lila's fingers tugged gently on her mother's sleeve, the way silence in that room no longer felt heavy. When the story ended, Lila stood and turned to Jonathan. "Can we open just one gift tonight?" He raised an eyebrow. "Only if you pick mine." She beamed, ran to the tree, and pulled out a small box with a blue ribbon. She handed it to him with both hands and watched as he slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a tiny snow globe, hand-painted, with 3 figures standing outside a little brownstone under falling snow. He didn't speak for a moment. "I painted it at school," Lila said. "I told them this is what Christmas looks like now." He looked at her, then at Maya, and then back down at the snow globe in his hands. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "It's perfect." Lila opened one gift too, a bracelet made of braided leather and silver beads, with a charm in the shape of a house. "Now you always carry home with you," Maya whispered. They sat in silence after that, a warm, complete silence. Later, after Lila had fallen asleep on the couch wrapped in a blanket and the quiet of the night had settled over the house, Jonathan stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the scene before him. A child who had once been freezing and forgotten, a woman who had nearly slipped away forever, and himself once hollow and untouchable, now grounded in something real. He stepped into the room, picked up Lila gently, and carried her to bed. As he tucked her in, she stirred and mumbled, half asleep. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" He paused, leaned down, and kissed her forehead. "Always." She smiled and drifted back into sleep. Jonathan stood there for a long time, then turned out the light. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, love quiet, steady, unshakable settled into the walls. Not the love of rescue, not the love of obligation, but the love that builds a life. And in that stillness, on their first real Christmas, a new story began. One not defined by how they met, but by everything they chose to become together. A family.